The great debate rages on. Who's going to be more beneficial for your team this year, running backs or wide receivers? We settle the argument right now. Headliner Nation, a couple of weeks ago, I did a video right here about the biggest lie in fantasy football. And that video proved to everybody that running backs are always going to be a safer investment than wide receivers. But at one point in the video, I mentioned that running backs also have more upside. And there were some comments and responses to that saying, hey, if there's more upside, then why don't you show us the total points they score? So I went through and broke down the total points scored from running back 1 all the way down to running back 36. I did the same thing for wide receivers. And then I went through all 18 weeks last season to determine who finishes within the top 36 more often than not. And in this video, I gotta give away another draft guide. So if we hit 1,000 likes on this video and you comment down below with either hashtag running back or hashtag wide receiver, and then give your opinion on the debate, I'll pick one of you to get a free draft guide. But we're gonna hop into it right away, and we're gonna take a look at running back scores first. Instead of breaking the positions out into just wide receiver or running back 1, 2, and 3, I actually split them out into 6 different categories. So last season, the average score for the running backs 1 through 6 was 290 points. Running backs 7 through 12 scored 218 points on average. 13 through 18 averaged 193 points. 19 through 24 averaged 168. 25 through 30 averaged 150 points. And 31 through 36 averaged 134 points. One point you notice right away is that the top 6 running backs, their points drop off significantly when you get to 7 through 12. So is it the same for wide receiver? On average last season, the wide receiver 1 through 6 scored 273 points. Wide receiver 7 through 12 dropped to 208 points. 13 through 18 was 188. 19 through 24 scored 169 on average. 25 through 30 averaged 151. And 31 through 36 averaged 144 points. Now here was where one of the biggest parts of the debate came up. Because in my last video, people were saying, well, Kyle, wide receivers typically score more than running backs, so wouldn't they have higher upside? And the numbers right here show you, because the top 6 running backs, on average, score more than the top 6 wide receivers. In fact, the first 3 groups of running backs all average more points than the first 3 groups of wide receivers. It's not until you get to the last 3 groups of wide receivers that they start to significantly outpace the running backs. And that only reinforces part of the argument that we have made for years that getting your running backs early is more beneficial to your team. Because not only are your higher tier running backs going to score more than your higher tier wide receivers, but then the lower tier wide receivers are going to score more than the lower tier running backs. So obviously going with a balanced approach is fine, because people are going to comment on this video and say, hey, I'm going to go with the best player available. And that makes sense. And that is absolutely fine. Really, these videos are aimed at those individuals that are saying, hey, I'm going heavy wide receiver early, or I want to draft 3 wide receivers in the first 4 rounds, or 2 in the first 3, or something like that. The data continues to back up that having a legit high upside running back 1 or even 2 of them is going to be more beneficial to your roster throughout the course of the season. Because again, those top running backs are going to score more than the top wide receivers. And then later in your draft, hopefully when you're getting some bargains at wide receiver, those are going to end up scoring more than the guys that you would draft at the running back position later on. But let's break it down even further at this point, starting with running back. There were 43 running backs that scored 100 or more fantasy points in half PPR leagues last season. 3 of them scored over 300 points. 3 more scored over 250 points. 8 of them scored over 200 points. 14 went over 150, and 15 went over 100, which means 6.9% of the running backs last season scored either over 300 points or over 250 points. 18% scored over 200, then 32% scored over 150, and 34% scored over 100. And yes, I know those numbers don't add up to 100% because I didn't round up. But let's take a look at wide receivers now, because there were 53 wide receivers that scored more than 100 fantasy points last year. But the difference is only one player went over 300 points. 4 wide receivers went over 250, 5 wide receivers went over 200, 16 wide receivers went over 150, and 27 wide receivers scored 100 or more points. Less than 2% of the wide receivers go over 300 total points, which again was just one person last year, and significantly less than the 6.9% of running backs. Then 7.5% of the wide receivers went over 250, which was a little bit higher than running backs. Then running backs have another advantage over 200 points because only 9.5% of wide receivers scored in that area. Then the number jumps to 30% for over 150, and then the number jumps all the way to 50% for wide receivers that scored over 100 points. Meaning, if you take a look at the 53 wide receivers last season that scored 100 or more fantasy points, half of them only scored between 100 and 150 fantasy points. Once again, the numbers suggest to us and show us, based on everything you see on the screen, that drafting running backs early are going to give you a better advantage than drafting wide receivers early. And I'm saying running backs and wide receivers, plural. This video is not to say, hey, if you decide with the #1 overall pick that you want to take Justin Jefferson, I'm not arguing against that, because I do believe that Justin Jefferson going #1 overall is truly warranted. But then if you're going to use your second and or third round pick on wide receivers, that's where things start to get a little bit dicey, because that is where your team will end up being hurt. So even if you decide to go with a balanced approach and draft 1 running back with 1 wide receiver, maybe grab 1 wide receiver, then go 2 running backs, that is the type of structure that you want to have through the first 3 to 4 rounds. And it also again reinforces that the 0 running back strategy doesn't work. The only people that have had success with the 0 running back strategy are those that got lucky. That's it. You either have injuries that pop up, or you grab somebody late that is a rookie that came out of nowhere. That doesn't happen very often. All right, I'm not going to break it down week by week because that's going to take forever. But once again, as I mentioned, I went through all 18 weeks of the NFL season last year. And then I logged the number of running backs and wide receivers that scored with inside the top 12, the top 24, in the top 36. And once again, if this video gets 1,000 likes, I'm gonna pick somebody who comments hashtag running back or hashtag wide receiver down in the comments to win a free draft guide. If you haven't gotten yours yet, I would highly encourage you to buy it right now. The link to our website is in the description of the video. It's only $21.99, and if you win any free draft guide throughout the year, we'll just refund you the price. But this draft guide has almost 300 videos that are exclusive to the draft guide and that you won't find on YouTube. And I also have exclusive content in the draft guide that you won't find on any fantasy platform in the industry. For the price, you will not get a more comprehensive and in-depth tool to use to rock your fantasy drafts this season. So head to our website, get yours right now, because you are not going to want to miss any of it. And I guarantee you it's going to take more than enough time going through it that you're going to need to start early. All right, but let's go ahead and toss up the totals from all of those weeks last season. Running backs finished inside the top 12 53 times. Wide receivers finished inside the top 12 60 times. So yes, there was a little bit of an advantage there for the wide receivers. But once you look at the amount of times these positions finish with inside the top 24, the average clearly goes in favor of the running backs once again. Because running backs had 64 performances that finished inside the top 24 last year. Wide receivers only had 45. And when you drop down to the top 36, it does go back to advantage wide receivers again, because there was 52 instances when running backs finished inside the top 36 compared to 67 times for wide receivers. But that would make sense, right? Because there's more wide receivers scoring fantasy points than there are running backs. There's just more wide receivers on the field at any given time than there are running backs. And we already showed you in the numbers a minute ago that nearly 50% of the wide receivers that scored more than 100 fantasy points last year were between 100 to 150. So a lot of those performances would be within inside the top 36. But once again, if we're talking about upside here in scoring fantasy points, more running backs finish inside the top 24 players on a weekly basis than wide receivers, because running backs have a 20-game advantage over wide receivers when it comes to finishing inside the top 24 overall players. Headliner Nation, I honestly don't know how deeper I can go on this topic. I've broke down overall performances for you, I've broken down fantasy numbers, I've even taken it all the way down to the weekly performances. And the numbers continue to show that hitting on your running backs early are always going to be more beneficial to your team than wide receivers, because hitting on your wide receivers late over running backs will also be more beneficial to your team. But with all things fantasy football, it still takes a considerable amount of luck, because you could feel like you absolutely nail your draft. Injuries could come out of nowhere, maybe a suspension. You never know what's going to happen. But please, for the love of God, we have got to move away from the mindset that zero running back actually works, because that takes even more luck than drafting a balanced team to start. And even if you don't want to go zero running back and you want to try and hammer on some of those values at the running back position this year, that is okay as well, because you are getting some decent value in that third round for running backs. So again, in your first round, if you decide you want to go Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Cooper Kupp, AJ Brown, whoever it may be in the first round, Tyreek Hill, if you want to start with a wide receiver, feel more than welcome to. Just know that your next two picks, if you get good running back value and you start wide receiver, running back, that is going to be a big key to success this year. But if you were to go wide receiver, running back, or wide receiver, running back, wide receiver, that is where you could start to get into trouble. But yo, Headliner Nation, I need y'all to hit the like button on the way out of here, because this video took me quite some time to pull numbers from the entire season. And if you're new here, make sure you subscribe, because I don't see anybody diving deep the way that we do. We're setting you all up for success, I promise you. But I'm gonna get out of here for now. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe and healthy. And I'll catch y'all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.